In this video, we're going to be discussing spun bearings. What causes them, what are the symptoms, and what is the best way to fix them. Hey guys, Josh with the Adept Ape channel here, and today we're going to be talking about spun bearings. What are they? What causes them? How do you fix them? What are the symptoms of them? Before we get into that, though, I wanted to thank Joe, Chad, James, Ken, and Steven for sending donations since the last video at adeptape@yahoo.com. Thank you very much. And let's get into the video. So, before we start, I would like to show you a magic trick. Behold, a rod bearing. But with my magic mechanic fingers, I can make this rod bearing turn into two rod bearings. How do I do this magic? Well, it's a spun bearing. That's how I can do it. Now, normally, rod bearings you can't do that with, because if you stack them, they'll stack like this. But this one's spun, and as you can see, heavily damaged, not reusable. Extremely heavy damage to the bearing on the back and the front side, and that's actually how I found this bearing. Customer complaint was the engine wouldn't start. They thought it was an electrical issue, but the engine was actually seized, and what had happened was the lower part of the rod bearing had moved up on top of the other one, and it was causing the piston to sit higher in the cylinder because you have that extra bearing stacked on top of the other one, and it hit the valves. It's pretty bad news. And if you're not familiar with what a normal rod bearing would look like, so this is our spun one. This is our other spun one. Here's a normal rod bearing. Okay? You can see the thickness differences. Obviously, this one is not reusable. Let's talk about the two telltale signs of rod bearing damage if you have a bearing out. The first major one is there's no bearing tab left. Do you see the tab on this one right here? Okay, that's called your bearing tab. A spun bearing will not have those. They'll be worn off from spinning inside of the bearing housing. Also, a spun bearing will have damage on the backside. A back of a bearing should never have damage. It should be smooth. You can also usually see the part number still. Still see the part number there. This one you cannot. So, spun bearing, bad news. So let's talk about what is a spun bearing. Obviously these are, but so is this. This is a spun bearing. This is out of a 3208. This is also a spun bearing. Pretty bad. Pretty bad. Now this bearing, these are rod bearings by the way, out of the same engine as this one. Now is this a spun bearing? No, it's not. It has heavy damage on the front. Still has the bearing tab though. So that means even though it's heavily damaged, bearing hasn't actually moved in the bearing housing. The backside is not damaged, it's still smooth, and you can still see the part numbers. Okay, unlike this one. So, these are rod bearings. They're usually the ones to spin. So, that's what a spun bearing is. Your bearing is there to protect either your crankshaft, your camshaft, and your block from damage. It is supposed to stay still, basically, and have a oil layer that protects the metal rotating part from the non-rotating parts, either the head or the block, the crank, the rod, and when it spins, that is bad news. So what it does is obviously it damages the bearing, but a spun bearing doesn't only damage the bearing. It damages whatever else it's in. So wherever it's seated, if it's a main bearing, so we have this is a main bearing, an upper. If this were to spin, you would damage your block because it sits in the block, and it would damage the crank because it protects the crank from the block, and it's supposed to have an oil area there. And this is a pretty standard bearing when you remove it. This is a used bearing. You can see there are some dirt got in this bearing at one time. Small striations from dirt. That's pretty normal, but the bearing did its job, because no matter what you do, you're always going to get some contamination, dirty oil, and it's going to damage the bearing a little bit. But bearings are extremely cheap and fairly easy to replace. Blocks and cranks are not. So, now that we know what a spun bearing is, let me show you kind of what the damage, not only to the bearings, but what it can damage on the engine is. I'll show you a few pictures here. Okay, so what we're looking at here, this is the crank journal for the rod bearing that it's spun. You can see it almost looks like the rod bearing. It has heavy damage to it, and this would have to get repaired or replaced before it could be reused and put a new bearing on it, or it will not properly work. Now, this is the damage to the rod, and this picture doesn't really do it justice. It has fairly heavy damage. This would be not reusable, like I said, unless it is repaired, but rods are not usually that expensive. You'd probably just want to have it replaced opposed to having it repaired. Okay, so now we know what a spun bearing is. What causes that? Bearings aren't supposed to move. They're designed not to move. They're designed to protect, like I said, the hard metal pieces from rotating hard metal pieces typically. You've already seen a rod and a main bearing. This is a cam bearing, typical cam bearing. They're usually round and a single piece, at least on most of the cats. And a bearing does its job by sitting in a bearing housing, rather than the block or the head or whatever. And it's not supposed to move. I mean, even if it's a rod bearing, it will rotate with the crank, but the bearing doesn't move, okay? It should stay whatever position it's in. It will rotate, but it does not move. And the reason for that is not the bearing tabs. I think a lot of people think the bearing tab is what keeps it from rotating. That's not true. Bearing tab is pretty weak. The bearing tab is actually used to align the bearing when you're installing them. And how a bearing works is you put the lower and the upper in place, and when you torque either your rod bolt or your main bolt, they're actually slightly larger than wherever they're sitting. And what it'll do is it'll crush them slightly. So the bearing is squished. The force of the rod or the main and the block will squish the bearing in place. So it has outward pressure that it's exerting in the housing it sits in. Now, it's a lot of pressure. That's really the only thing keeping that bearing in place, is that outward pressure. And that's why when you install bearings, you never put anything on the back side of the bearing. You don't want to put oil, assembly grease, anything. You want it dry and clean, because if you put oil there, that's going to create a film that when you torque it and that bearing crushes, it's going to crush against the oil. It's not going to have a good seal, and you could spin any bearing, crank, cam, rod bearing. Okay, so now we know how the bearing works. Let's talk about why one would spin. Now, I've been referring to it as a bearing housing, but the actual term is a journal, and that is where the bearing will sit. Your bearing journal, bearing housing. So, a bearing, as already mentioned, is there to protect the expensive metal parts. And this is a used rod bearing. This is one I was showing you before, and you can see there's some minor damage to the face of the bearing. That's very common. This bearing has several 100,000 miles on it, and it looks fairly new. This was in a well-maintained engine. And maintenance is the biggest cause of spun bearings, or I should say a lack of maintenance. You know, these 3208 ones I was showing you that are, incredibly damaged. The ones that weren't spin, that engine had multiple spun bearings. The ones that weren't spin, they all look like this anyways. This is the non-spun one. It was heavily damaged on the face. And this is usually caused to a lack of maintenance, not doing your oil changes for the most part in the recommended mileage intervals. And because once your oil starts to break down, you're going to get contaminants, you're going to get poor lubrication from that oil, and it's going to cause these nicks, the oil breakdown, more dirt. It's going to damage the bearing. And that's when you can get a spun bearing, because once you start getting friction between the rotating part and the bearing, it's going to start catching. And that's what you do not want. There's a lot of energy getting released, and it's supposed to go into the crankshaft and help it rotate. But when that energy is used as friction against the bearing's going to heat up, and that friction is going to be working against this bearing. And remember, the bearings are only held in place by that crushing process I already discussed. And as they heat up, remember, metals expand as they heat up, and friction is a very good way to increase heat. That bearing can lose that crush, and it's also trying to get turned by the crankshaft. And if it catches at all, it's going to spin. And once it moves a little bit, it'll usually wipe those bearing tabs off. Not only that, once it moves a little bit, the possibility of contaminants getting behind the bearing goes up. And once the crush is gone, it's going to spin. And once it starts spinning, it's usually going to seize to the crankshaft, and then it's just going to spin in the journal, aka housing. And that's when you're done. That's when you have multiple, usually you'll get multiple bearings being damaged at once if it's due to lack of maintenance. Now, the one I was showing you where they had stacked on top of each other, that engine was actually fairly well maintained. It was clean. The overheads had been performed. The oil had been serviced. This was probably bad luck, and that's going to be, even though it spun, you know, every once in a while you might get something. Something might come apart in the oil galley, get caught in there, cause it to seize. You know, that can be a problem. But there's not much you can do if it's just a bad luck situation. If you've done your maintenance, maintenance is the #1 thing. Make sure you do your maintenance, and you should have bearings that, you know, after several $100,000 are going to look pretty good. Now, there are other things that can lead to a spun bearing. If you have piston contact with something, that potentially can damage your bearing, because the oil film that's in there is keeping the metal parts apart, and it's designed to work with, you know, heavy combustion process pressures. But if you have a, let's say, a valve or something were to hit that piston, that's way more pressure than the combustion process, and it's usually at the wrong time. You know, the combustion's happening as the piston's supposed to be starting to come down. You know, you don't want your combustion to happen before it's at TDC, or else that can also cause possibly some bearing damage. Pre-detonation, that can possibly cause that. Like I said, maintenance is the usual issue here. But these are just some possible other things that could damage that bearing, cause it to spin. Ones I've seen before also, if you have something that's hurting your thrust bearings, which I'll show you a little picture of what a thrust bearing is, not exactly the same. If something's hurting that thrust bearing, it can heat up that main journal. And I've seen the #4, at least on cats, the #4 main spin from that thrust bearing being damaged enough and causing heat in that bearing journal housing area. And that can cause a spun bearing as well. Okay? If you suspect you might have a spun bearing, let's get into the symptoms for that. So depending on how bad and which bearing is failed, can determine what your symptoms are going to be. So the engine that came in with the spun rod bearing was actually seized up. That's not usually the symptoms you'll see, though, with a spun main bearing or a spun rod bearing. You will normally see, let's start with rod bearings. So a spun rod bearing is going to, first off, reduce the gap, or increase the gap, I should say, between your rod and the bearing and the crank. So if this hadn't rotated up under the other one, but it was spinning, it's a lot thinner, so you have a bigger oil gap. So you'll get something called rod knock. And what that is, it's a heavy, deep knock, and what that is when the engine is on the power stroke, so the piston's coming up, it then fires and is pushing down. That heavy force of the power stroke is squishing the oil out of this bearing area between the rod and the crank journal. And you'll get a knock, usually, because there's not supposed to be much clearance there, only a couple thousandths. And if you're dealing with, you know, we're talking almost a 1/16 of an inch or something, you know, or tens of thousandths of a gap, you're going to start to get a knock, and that's going to get worse and worse until something comes apart. And if you keep running it like that, you can have a rod coming out of the side of your block. That's a real common failure, is the rod bearings. And another reason for that is the rods get oil after the mains. Mains don't spin as often. Also, when a main spins, the symptoms are a little harder usually to find. Because a main is not supporting a piston, it's supporting the crankshaft, so you don't usually get a knock if you have a spun main bearing. You'll normally have, but not always have, lower oil pressure. You might have higher metal or bearing materials in an oil sample. If you pull your oil pan, you might find metal debris in there. These are more common of a main bearing failure, especially if you don't have a knock. If you don't have a knock, but your oil pressure suddenly drops a lot, that can be caused by a main bearing failure. Now, a cam bearing, you might not really get hardly any symptoms. The cam gets lubricated away from the crankshaft, obviously. You know, a lot of engines are overhead cam, so they're getting oil fed to them well after the crankshaft does. You might not really see a reduction in oil pressure with a spun main or a spun cam bearing, but you might see, like I said, you might see, if you do oil sampling, you might see higher bearing materials, higher iron, and that cam bearing can actually get so bad that it'll just end up seizing in place, and you can get gear train damage. You might get actually a twisted or broken camshaft. But these do not spin, at least on cats, very often. Other engines, they do. So those are the symptoms of having a spun bearing, basically. And we're talking about, these are obviously your main engine bearings. There are smaller bearings in the water pump and the oil pump, things like that. But those are mostly ball bearings, roller bearings. And what I'm talking about here are these type bearings, okay? Now let's cue the sad music, because we're about to talk about what fixes a spun bearing. Now, as I mentioned before, bearings are cheap. They're made to be replaced. You know, a set of bearings might be $20 each or something. Not very expensive. But the problem is the components that they are protecting are extremely expensive and usually very labor intensive to repair. So depending on which one has failed, you might be out a lot of money. And let's start with probably one of the cheaper ones, depending on the engine design. So let's say you have a C15, which is an overhead cam engine, and your camshaft bearing has spun. And you might be saying, that's a cam bearing? That's a cam bearing on a C15, if you're not familiar with diesel engines. And this cam bearing, if it spins in the head's basically junk. You would have to pull the camshaft out. The camshaft's probably junk as well. Depending on the machine shop, they might be able to repair the head and then get it reused. But normally, you know, heads aren't extremely expensive. If you spin a overhead cam engine cam bearing, you're probably gonna have to change the head and the camshaft. So that's a lot of money, obviously. The next thing we'll get to is the rod bearings. So this was a rod bearing failure. And what does a rod bearing protect? Well, it protects the crank from your connecting rod, your piston pack. So when that spins, that's going to damage your connecting rod and the crankshaft. Now, the crankshaft can be repaired if it is removed, and then it can be cut, and you can use something called either an oversized or undersized bearing, and then you'll usually use the corresponding oversized or undersized rod bearing to make up the difference in what was cut, and you have to use an oversized or undersized bearing as well. And what that will do is that will bring your tolerances back up to spec, and normally if you're cutting one, you'll probably want to cut all 6 if it's a 6-cylinder engine, obviously. I'm sure some guys don't, but that's my recommendation. Now, the worst one you can get is a main bearing spin, and the reason for that is that protects, this is not a spun main, but this is a main bearing, that protects your crankshaft from your engine block. So if that one spins, that's damaging the crankshaft and the engine block. So you'll have to remove your engine, then get your crank machine, the block machine. It's a major deal, obviously. So you're, depending on if you want to have it repaired versus replaced, you might end up looking at just buying a used engine or a new engine opposed to having it replaced. They can be repaired, but it is very expensive, obviously, because you're having to remove the engine, remove the crankshaft, which means you're having to pull your structures off. So it's really bad news. Saying you spun a bearing is basically, about as bad as saying you dropped a valve. Catastrophic failure. It's not really a simple fix. A drop valve can actually be a cheaper fix. Say you have a, say you have a C13 or something with liners, and you drop a valve. You can change the head, change the piston pack without any machining. Whereas pretty much any spun bearing, you are replacing some very expensive components. Almost the whole engine, if you're talking about a main bearing. Even a rod bearing, you'd have to remove the crankshaft. So that is my video on what is a spun bearing and what are the symptoms. All right, thank you for watching.